October 29th, 1929. The most catastrophic day in Wall Street history. Black Tuesday, as it would forever be known, triggered the most dire and severe economic downturn in U.S. history. By the end of 1930, the banks were crumbling. Production in factories began to fall, and unemployment doubled, leaving millions of Americans out of work and plunged into poverty. 1933 was one of the darkest chapters in America. Thousands of banks had failed. Industry was plummeting, and unemployment reached roughly 25%. As FDR began to work on the New Deal, the Dust Bowl ravaged the Great Plains, creating massive blizzard-like dust storms that blanketed 19 states, devastating communities, forcing mass migration, and destroying millions of acres of farmland. Fear, hunger, depression, and hardship abounded. Poverty was the way of life for millions of Americans, and hope was in short supply. And against that bleak and desolate backdrop, two young lovers captivated the nation's attention. Born in 1910, Bonnie Parker was a creative and bright young woman living in her home state of Texas. She loved writing poetry, acting, and reading romance novels. She dreamed of a life beyond her tired and troubled reality. And when she met Clyde Barrow in 1930, little did she know that she soon would be catapulted to stardom. A year older than Bonnie, Clyde had lived a life revolving around crime. Although, like many criminals, he began his career with petty theft and property crimes, after a few brutal stints in prison, Clyde emerged as a hardened, violent criminal. Although Bonnie and Clyde are now typically remembered as Robin Hood-type miscreants, the truth is a lot more violent and tragic. Alongside a crew of various accomplices, Bonnie and Clyde and the Barrow Gang, as they would come to be known, began a 2-year crime spree that involved theft, car heists, kidnapping, and worst of all, murder. Although legend would have you believe that they mainly stole from major corporations, the reality is that most of their targets were modest mom-and-pop establishments, privately owned gas stations, stores, and restaurants. They never really struck it big, and usually only walked away with a few bucks, speeding away in a stolen car. The gang had a massive arsenal of stolen firearms and were not afraid to use them. At least 13 people were killed by the group, 9 of whom were police officers. While Bonnie herself is not thought to have killed anyone, she did help break Clyde out of prison, transported weapons, hid and concealed violent criminals, helped kidnap a police officer, and constantly evaded the law. Newspapers had a field day publishing stories about the violent gang, and most of all, the pair of star-crossed lovers now known as Bonnie and Clyde. However, on April 13th, 1933, the press were sent a gift from above. In Joplin, Missouri, the police had raided a hideout used by the gang, and there they discovered a trove of undeveloped film. The photographs were worth more than 1,000 words. Pictures of Clyde posing with stolen cars, snaps of Bonnie with a cigar in her mouth and a gun in her hand. The photos were playful, stylish, and romantic. They were perfect for the front page of any newspaper. And overnight, photos of the young lovers hit every newsstand in the United States. But behind the pictures of gangsters jacking cars and smoking cigars was the harsh reality of exhaustion, of lives living constantly on the run. The fatigue and fear were wearing on the pair. And things only got worse when Clyde, driving a stolen Ford, accidentally crashed and overturned the vehicle, spilling battery acid onto Bonnie's right leg, causing severe burns that went down to the bone. She never properly healed from those injuries and struggled to walk for the rest of her limited days. After this event, the gang were often described by witnesses as dirty, hungry, paranoid, and increasingly unstable. And by 1934, the police too were worn out. Early on a hot and humid May morning, 6 police officers hid behind bushes and trees along a lonely stretch of road in the Louisiana countryside. Rifles in hand, they were silent, waiting for the roar of a V8 Ford engine. As the sun continued to rise in the sky, the faint puttering of the engine could be heard in the distance. Inside the Ford were the 2 most wanted criminals in America, Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow, driving straight into the law's trap. As the car passed the lawman, the police opened fire. The ambush was over in less than a minute, but in that time, hundreds of bullets cut through the silent countryside, peppering the Ford, tearing apart its steel body, and ending the lives of 23-year-old Bonnie and 24-year-old Clyde. Their reign of robbery and rampage over at last. But nearly a century on, we still remember this pair, whose legacy has transcended their lives, crimes, and bloody, tragic deaths. Hey friends, it's Becca. For the past 5 years, the West London Witch team has been dedicated to bringing you the best supernatural stories at the highest studio quality. And by team, I mean me and my buddy Danny. We do this work totally for free because we love it. We're proud of our content and appreciate the wonderful interactions we get to have with storytellers and listeners just like yourself. If you're enjoying the West London Witch, maybe consider joining our Patreon. It's a way to further engage with us and show your support for 2 creatives. If you're in a position to spare enough each month for us to grab a cup of coffee in between edits or add to the piggy bank for a new microphone, we would love to see you in our Patreon community. But I know times are tough, so if you're not in a position to join Patreon right now, that's okay. We aren't going anywhere. Head on over to patreon.com/The West London Witch. For as little as £1, $1, €1 a month, you can gain full access to our coven, a space where we share behind-the-scenes stories, dive deeper into each episode, answer your questions, and have special little treats to thank you for sharing your love and kindness with your favorite little witch. Hello, and welcome to episode 112 of The West London Witch, a podcast where we share stories about those moments where we find ourselves very much not alone. Last season, author and researcher Silvia Pettem joined us to share the incredible story of Boulder Jane Doe. Silvia's work is so industrious, so detailed, and literally life-changing. I was delighted when she agreed to come back on the show to share the incredible story of America's longest-running female fugitive, the notorious and sensationalized blonde tigress. The same year Bonnie and Clyde were gunned down in rural Louisiana, a new, murderous, gun-wielding, violent blonde rose to prominence. Well, at least, that's what the newspapers would have liked you to believe. However, unlike Bonnie and Clyde, this tigress slinked away into the shadows, triggering one of the biggest and longest manhunts in U.S. history. For nearly 9 decades, her story remained a mystery. That is, until Silvia broke the case. I'm Rebecca Strazina, and this is The West London Witch, episode 112, In Search of the Blonde Tigress.
So I was perusing the internet one day. This was a couple years ago, and I have odd things that I like to look up, and I happened to look up missing fugitives. I found the name Eleanor Jarman, and she was the, quote, longest running missing female fugitive in America. And she went missing in 1940. And that's all I knew initially. And I thought, well, 1940, that's a fun era to research, and just after Prohibition and all that. So I thought, well, very naively, why don't I see what I can find? If she's the longest running missing fugitive, maybe I can make a dent in that and see.
As you will remember from the Boulder Jane Doe case, Silvia has a real talent for solving mysteries. If something ever happens to me, I want Silvia on the case. Her attention to detail, her thorough research, and ability to make a full picture from tiny fragments is incredible. Silvia is a real-life superhero. In order to fill in the holes and create a picture of who Eleanor was, where she went, and where she could be now, Silvia had to go back in time and sift through mountains and mountains of primary resources.
So I started researching old newspaper articles and found all kinds of sensationalized things about this gangster woman and dangerous woman and robberies that she had participated in.
Eleanor was no saint, but her life before her infamous crime spree had not been easy. Born in 1901 in Sioux City, Iowa, Eleanor spent her whole life in the throes of poverty. She left school at a young age to earn a living as a waitress. She married young and had 2 sons, but the marriage didn't last, and she soon found herself living as a single mother in Chicago, Illinois. After her marriage ended, she did have a few boyfriends, but it was her relationship with a Mr. George Dale that would be her undoing. During a particularly lean time in Eleanor's life, George came in and helped provide and take care of Eleanor and her sons. But life in the 1930s was tough. Money was limited. The Great Depression was ravaging the nation. And desperate times called for desperate measures.
She got involved in petty crimes and shop robberies in downtown Chicago. And this was in 1933. And she got involved with a boyfriend named George and then another man named Leo, who was the, quote, getaway driver. And they were considered daylight robbers because they would go around to very small stores. This was in downtown, a big city, Chicago, downtown, where there was like a little men's clothing store or something. And the proprietor was there at the cash register. And maybe there were other people and maybe there weren't. And if they went into the store and there were other people, they just sort of shopped around and left. But if they were the only customers, which was often the case, they would hold up the shopkeeper and try to rob money from the cash register or steal some merchandise, that sort of thing.
The trio became pros at this grift, and it worked well. They had successfully pulled off around 30 daylight robberies. And the thing is, the law was really on their side. According to the Chicago Tribune crime statistics at the time, the city averaged 1,344 robberies a month. But only 1 out of every 25 robbers ever faced conviction. The likelihood of the trio being caught and convicted was so low that it was worth the risk. But everything changed on August 4th, 1933. Around 2 p.m, Eleanor, her boyfriend George, and their accomplice Leo headed to the father and son shoe store at 4050 West North Avenue. The shop was empty with just the owner tending to the store. The trio successfully pulled off their well-rehearsed heist, walking out with $80 in cash, a watch, and a couple of fountain pens. Altogether, they stole over $2,000 worth of goods in today's money. A lucrative afternoon. But they weren't done yet. 40 minutes later, the sound of gunshots filled the air and a man lay dying on the sidewalk. 71-year-old Gustav Hoa was working alone in his men's clothing shop when the trio came in under the pretense of shopping. What unfolded next is terribly murky. Silvia has pulled all of the primary resources she could from police reports, court transcripts, and news articles. But what we know for sure is that once Eleanor, George, and Leo entered the shop, something went terribly wrong. Their usual tactics did not work. A scuffle ensued, and George pulled a gun and shot Mr. Hoa. Up until now, they had never harmed anyone. Yes, these robberies were serious crimes, but they had not presented physical danger to the proprietors before. This was a whole new level of criminality. The street Mr. Hoa's shop was located on was a busy and bustling thoroughfare. Although the shop itself was quiet at the time, the road was not. There were a slew of witnesses who called in to report the crime. And as the police sped to 5948 West Division Street, they found poor Mr. Hoa lying on the sidewalk bleeding. As witnesses gathered around him, Eleanor and the men fled the crime scene in a dark blue Chevrolet sedan, leaving Mr. Hoa to die in front of his own shop. This was a brazen and bloody crime, and as the trio raced away hoping to fade into obscurity, the newspapers catapulted this story into the big leagues. There was a real appetite for this type of story, and reporters were all vying for top billing. As the story of the crime began to twist, grow, and become even more thrilling and dramatic. And much like Bonnie and Clyde, this story had a really interesting element. A small, petite, blonde woman.
And just the fact that she was even there, the press started sensationalizing her as the blonde tigress. The newspapers gave her that title to make it sound more thrilling so people would buy more newspapers. I mean, really, it was just sensationalism. But they would often say the blonde tigress and her pals, or the girl gang, or something like that. They made it sound like she was in charge, and she wasn't at all.
Eleanor was absolutely involved, complicit, and did commit a crime. But she was not the killer. This was not her idea. She did not plan the robberies. And she wasn't a mobster in charge of an elaborate crime syndicate. This was a desperate, impoverished, single mom who fell into the wrong crowd, made bad choices, but ultimately was just trying to survive during a really difficult time. She did do bad things. She was a criminal. The situation is very nuanced. But the news was determined to make her a villain.
There were things in the newspaper that she kicked the dying shopkeeper while he was lying on the ground, and none of the witnesses said that she did that. So that was all just made up.
Regardless of whether the news was true or not, the whole city of Chicago was on the lookout for the three perpetrators, and in particular, the blonde tigress. The trio went on the lam. Eleanor dyed her hair red, a page straight from Bonnie Parker's book, and then turned her attention to her children. The boys couldn't stay in Chicago, so she reached out to an old boyfriend, Richard Slater, and asked him to make sure that her sons were safely delivered to her sister back in Iowa. But it wasn't long before the jig was up.
I think it was after about 5 days, the police knocked down the door of where they were hiding and took them off to jail.
Photos of the now dark-haired blonde tigress were splashed across all of the newspapers as the case headed to court. Unfortunately, the trio's luck had run out.
By the time of the trial, it was a very quick trial. I think it only lasted 4 days. It was a very speedy trial, and the district attorney and the prosecution, they were all very focused on. There was a wonderful little quote that said, let's get as many people to the electric chair as we can. I mean, they were determined to crack down on crime. So by the time it even went to trial, everybody had read all of this. It wasn't like you found a jury that hadn't read a newspaper. So everything was stacked against her.
Hungry to make an example of the gang, George, the shooter, was convicted of murder, and Eleanor and Leo were convicted as accomplices to murder. George was sentenced to death by way of the electric chair, and Eleanor and Leo both received 199-year prison sentences, a massive and unprecedented punishment.
And she was sent off to what was called a reformatory that actually turned out to be a reformatory. It was a very progressive women's prison that was not there to punish women. It was there to rehabilitate them.
Eleanor was sent to the truly innovative and forward-thinking Oakdale Reformatory for Women. This was no steel and concrete penitentiary, but rather a green and luscious country estate trimmed with castle-like turrets and perfectly manicured gardens.
It looked like a kind of like a resort or something. It was very, very nice, and it was only a year or two old when she got there. So it was this new place with a new progressive, for 1933, this was very progressive, a new way of incarcerating women. They didn't just lock them in cells. They all had jobs. Eleanor worked in the laundry. Women who hadn't graduated from high school were told they had to go and get their GED or whatever. They had to graduate from high school while they were there. It was just a very interesting place for me to research, because I was expecting all kind of, hardcore, depressing kind of place, and it wasn't like that at all. And the administrator, her name was Hazel Hazard. I think that's a wonderful name. In her documentation, there's files about Eleanor, and she calls Eleanor a model prisoner. She did everything just right. She didn't cause any trouble. She was kind of a model to the other prisoners, and she got to work on time. She did her work, and she did everything right.
Until she didn't. The thing is, when you have a sentence of 199 years, taking chances, being bold, pushing boundaries might seem like they're worth the risk. After all, what's the worst that can happen? A life sentence? After 7 years of impeccable behavior, Eleanor and a fellow inmate, Margaret Curringer, orchestrated a great escape.
Eleanor, after being this model prisoner for 7 years, suddenly climbs over the fence, and this very progressive prison, all it had was a 12-foot high barbed wire fence around the edge with cornfields on the outside. There weren't any guard towers. There weren't any walls. I mean, it was the kind of place you could easily escape from, but they were kind of on the honor system. And the other woman, Margaret, she was not very smart because she kept getting caught again, but she did know how to escape because she had done that several times. So what they did was they stole some clothing from the staff quarters, and they carried it with them, and they climbed over the 12-foot barbed wire fence. And then on the other side, later, the prison officials found their prison clothes, so they had obviously changed into the clothing that they had stolen. And they hitchhiked toward Chicago. They were about 100 miles southwest of Chicago, and they were just two pretty girls in nice dresses, and they hitchhiked and disappeared in Chicago. It was probably quite easy to do.
Silvia has a hard time thinking that this escape plan was initiated by Eleanor, due to a few important historical facts. The first being that Margaret was a seasoned criminal who had been in and out of jail many times and had already successfully broken out of prison in the past.
And I think it was the other woman who suggested it to her, just said, "Come along with me, I'm going to escape," because the other woman was in and out of prisons. She was kind of a housekeeper for rich people, and she would steal all their jewels while she was babysitting their children and cleaning their house, that sort of thing. And she was in and out of all kinds of jails. She had escaped 2 or 3 times from other prisons. She knew how to escape. And she also knew that Eleanor was the one getting all the attention. She was still considered this beautiful blonde criminal who would, do all kinds of horrible things like kick dying people. And the other woman probably said, "I want to escape. Why don't you come with me?" And didn't say, "The police will be looking for you and not me." That's my opinion. But again, we don't really know.
The other factor to take into account when considering who the mastermind behind the escape was is the undeniable reality that Eleanor was a follower. She had followed along with George and Leo on their crime spree. She likely followed Margaret out of Oakdale, and she needed a lot of support when she was out in the free world. Eleanor had been dubbed by the media as the most dangerous woman alive. And Margaret was right. The authorities were definitely hot on the hunt for the blonde tigress.
Margaret did get caught a few months later, but all Eleanor had to do was to put on glasses or take off glasses or change her hairdo, or I go into it in my book. I think she connected up with the former boyfriend, the one who had taken her children to her sister's house. I think he kind of helped her on the outside. His name, the first boyfriend, was Richard Slater. Richard Slater had some connections with the underworld. He worked off and on for, I think it was the accountant of gangster Al Capone. He drove a taxi. That meant that he could be anywhere in the metropolitan Chicago area, and his wife wasn't saying, "Why aren't you home for dinner?" or something, So he had lots of mobility, connections with the underworld, and he apparently must have been a very kind person if he took her children to the sisters while she was hiding from police even though she had another boyfriend. I mean, it's all very complicated.
The relationship was definitely complicated. Richard was married, dabbling in some very salubrious circles, and was now helping a highly sought-after fugitive. Thanks to Silvia's incredible research, she connected with Richard's step-granddaughter, who had fond memories of the man. She did tell Silvia that the marriage between Richard and her grandmother was strained and problematic, therefore giving space for him to help Eleanor. But there is no doubt that Richard was dependable and a crucial element to Eleanor's success as a runaway.
He seems like a very nice kind of a guardian angel that just appeared there. So I think he was watching out for her all along. They might have had a plan that said, if you ever get out of here, call me at the taxi service or something. I mean, they must have had some way of making contact. And I think he was in the perfect position with his underworld connections to maybe find her a little hideaway. He actually owned a little cabin north of Chicago where I think he could have put her up for a month or two and brought her groceries as she was trying to figure out what to do next, and maybe help her get a Social Security card. They were very, very easy to get back then.
The rollout of Social Security cards began in 1935 during FDR's administration. The goal was to create a program to provide and track retirement benefits and unemployment insurance. However, the government didn't know who everybody was, so you, the applicant, needed to provide either your birth certificate or an affidavit stating your identity to the government, and a card would be administered. It was impossible to check every application, and gaining a new identity was incredibly simple and not so uncommon. This was the perfect opportunity for Eleanor to legally become somebody else and really disappear into the ether.
There were many years that went by. She escaped prison in 1940, and there was information in the press the FBI was looking for her, and that all is somewhat documented up through about 1951. And then she's off the radar.
Try as they might, the FBI could not pin down the elusive blonde tigress. 50 years later, in the early 90s, Eleanor's grandson started an initiative to try and find Eleanor. The FBI had long stopped searching for her, but the family were desperate to be reconnected.
He got interviewed by a number of newspapers and magazines and made kind of a little splash in the press. In one of those articles, and I've read them all, he said that he believed that she used the name Marie Millman, or maybe it was Millman, he wasn't sure, but used that as an alias. At that point, then when I read those articles, then I started doing much more extensive genealogical research, and I looked up every Marie Millman.
The Marie Silvia was looking for had to be around Eleanor's age, and she had to have spawned from nothingness. As Marie Millman would have been a fake name, any Maries who had parents, siblings, or any extended family at all were immediately discounted.
There couldn't be like an obituary that said so-and-so died and her sister Marie Millman is living in Chicago or something. I had to find somebody that had no connection with anybody. So I had to I had a big list of Marie Millmans, and then I had to eliminate the ones that had family, some kind of tie. And I finally got to one. I live in Colorado and was astounded that there was one in Denver, Colorado. And the more I researched this woman, the less I found. There wasn't any family for this woman. I found where she worked. I found where she lived. She worked as Marie Millman from 1951 when the record went cold in Illinois. This woman surfaces in Colorado in 1951 up until her death in 1980.
If Eleanor Jarman had become the Marie Millman who lived and worked in Denver, it's no wonder she didn't come forward when her family tried to reestablish contact in the 90s. She would have been dead for over a decade. But was this the right Marie?
I have researched every possible connection I could find, trying to find anybody in her family, and could not find any connection to anybody. And then the clincher for me is I sent off to the probate office. She died without a will, so she only had something like $4,000 when she died, but somebody had to figure out what to do with that $4,000. So there was a probate case opened up in Denver, and it lasted for a year and a half, and there was an administrator appointed to track down any heirs or anyone at all with any information at all, and he could not find anything. And so I thought, good, I confirmed that there is no connection with this woman with anybody. So I tell people now that I'm 99.9% sure that the woman buried in Fairmount Cemetery in Denver under the name Marie Millman is Eleanor Jarman.
Silvia cannot say for 100% certainty that this is Eleanor, because in order to do that, her body would have to be exhumed and have a DNA profile created. But Marie Millman wasn't a victim or a suspect in any crime or case. Therefore, she is not eligible for exhumation. And if this is Eleanor's grave, if she was dead, her criminal sentence would have been fulfilled. And she, too, no longer would be a part of the criminal justice system. So, there she lies, peacefully, eternally asleep in the Fairmount Cemetery. Free at last. But how was she able to go undetected for all that time?
In my opinion, she just blended into society. She worked as Marie Millman. She worked as a waitress from 51 almost until she died in 1980 at various restaurants on Denver's main street, Colfax Avenue. And she lived in various apartments close to where she worked. And she was a waitress before she even got involved in crime. When she was married, when her kids were little, she worked as a waitress to support them. And I think she just very easily went back into what she had known in her life, which was waiting on tables. And she was an attractive woman, but I think she easily could have blended in, with a different hairstyle or whatever, as just anybody. And I think she lived out her life as a very ordinary person.
The thing that really strikes me about Eleanor is that she never committed another crime. Sure, she escaped from jail, lived on the lam, and assumed a new identity. But she was never caught up again with the police. Eleanor was sentenced to 199 years at the Oakdale Reformatory. And arguably, she was successfully reformed in those 7 years that she spent incarcerated. She did assimilate back into the general public as a literally new woman and lived a quiet, average, normal life.
That's the one thing that the granddaughter is just thrilled about, because all her life she'd heard these horrible stories about how terrible her grandmother was. And for her to get some confirmation that, we're 99.9% sure that she just was a nice, normal, everyday waitress.
Silvia's book, In Search of the Blonde Tigress, The Untold Story of Eleanor Jarman, was very healing for Eleanor's family. It gave closure to a decades-long mystery. But there was one more hurdle. the public? Was someone in some distant, far-flung corner of the globe going to disagree with Silvia's conclusion?
I threw it out there to the whole world, the internet, and nobody has refuted it at all. I've had articles in the Denver newspaper and things that says, is Marie Mill and Eleanor Jarman, and it's gotten quite a bit of press, and nobody has come forward to say, you don't know what you're talking about. So I'm more convinced than ever.
This is the story of an ordinary woman who fell into a life of crime, becoming one of the most recognizable and infamous women in America, only to fade away into quiet obscurity. Silvia closes out her book with a quote from the columnist Ed Leahy, who reflected on the fate of Eleanor when in 1966 he wrote,
"When I am in some wayside diner late at night and a beat-up old doll in her 60s is dishing out chili, I'm tempted to ask if she's Eleanor, but I never do. I keep hoping that she got some good out of life. Good night, Eleanor Jarman, wherever you are."
When Silvia began researching this case in 2020, the search for the blonde tigress had gone stone cold. But due to her tenacity, persistence, and unbelievable research abilities, the search is now over. Peace of mind has been given to Eleanor's descendants, and Eleanor's story has now been told in full. Silvia's book has provided a clean, nuanced, balanced, and well-researched account of the true life and memory of Eleanor Jarman. A huge thank you to Silvia for joining us again here on the West London Witch to share her beautiful work with us. I cannot recommend her book, In Search of the Blonde Tigress, The Untold Story of Eleanor Jarman, enough. It's a gripping, emotive story from cover to cover, and a must-read for any true crime enthusiast. Do you have a spooky story you'd like to share? I'd love to hear it. Drop me an email at thewestlondonwitch@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Facebook at The West London Witch. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. And come and follow us for additional content on Instagram and Facebook. Until next time, merry meet, merry part, and merry meet again. The West London Witch is created by me, Rebecca Strazina. Our sound designer and production magician is the incredible Danny Cross. Our theme music was bespokely written and performed by the wickedly talented Kyle Hall. Our cover art is the beautiful collaboration between Lizzie Wilson and Jake Bowser. Special thanks to Miss Sinead Bowers, our quality control and biggest cheerleader. And thank you to you, all of our listeners all over the world. These are your stories. Thank you for sharing them with us.